To introduce you to my understanding of digital literacy, which really very much is concerned about understanding not only how much data there is and what we can do with data and how we can visualize it, the kind of calculations we can do with it, but to develop an understanding what it actually is we are doing when we are looking and speaking about societies and the world in general with and through data, and actually translate the social and the natural world into data that we then process into stories, into images, into all sorts of representations. And as I hope to show you today, there's a lot going on there that we need to be careful about and aware about in order to kind of prevent some of the negative repercussions you just heard about that data can actually introduce to societies. So here's a rough estimate. Could you guess how much data is produced or exists in the world today? These figures, we have to acknowledge, they're all very much speculative because in fact actually no one really knows. But if you compare different calculations from competent companies who have access to data to make estimates, the estimate currently ranges about 2.5 billion gigabytes of data are created every day. That's huge. I mean, how to give a dimension of this is pretty much impossible. But one way to visualize it is that's half as much of all the content produced since the beginning of recorded history up until the year of 2003. And 90% of the data, and that's significant, has actually been created in the past 2 years. And the interesting fact is that it's not just data-intensive industries, but actually us. It's 75% of all this data is created by us, the ordinary consumers, and the rest accounts for data-intensive industries. You know them, it's Google, it's Amazon, but also the New York Stock Exchange. You see a lot of those infographics. That's one way of visualizing it. I'm not sure about this figure, but there are good reasons to believe that the growth of data, the amount of data, actually grows faster than the world economy. And just to give you another dimension of it, you heard many of these figures over the past 2 days, how these amounts actually come about. It's our use of Facebook, it's our use of Twitter, it's our use of Instagram, and the rest, like I said, transactions we make through companies. But my point is not so much to highlight the proportions, but to alert you to the fact that all this data needs to be stored somewhere, and is in fact stored somewhere, right? Consuming manpower, electricity, natural resources on a massive scale. Servers, everyone know what a server is? What is going on? Okay. Everyone know what a server is? Servers need to be kept in very cool places, so to not overheat because they're kept busy all the time. So imagine the amounts of data I just pointed out to you, what it means to how many servers you need to kind of actually keep them stored, and how much electricity alone this produces. And so we now have more than 3 million data centers worldwide. Data centers are the places where this data is actually stored. And energy experts are increasingly warning about the energy consumption of these data centers and say that if we continue to produce data on this scale, our lifestyle will be simply unsustainable because we don't have the energy to kind of manage the digital footprint of our lives. And interestingly enough, this energy consumption and actually the toxic waste that the data volume that we produce puts out into the world, there's no single structure to even monitor or track or control the process and make sure that it's done in a way that kind of secures that we actually have a future on this planet. And so I'm pointing this out to you to alert you to the fact that we tend to think of data as this immaterial thing, something sitting there somewhere on a computer, and basically the optimistic assumptions in the beginning were that data will save energy because we travel less, we use our cars less, and so it's actually quite an environmental friendly technology. The contrary is the case. It comes as a powerful reminder how deeply data, in fact, has eaten its way into the material fabric and the material infrastructure of our everyday lives. And in that sense, not only changed the way we think and act in the world, but fundamentally transformed the basic building blocks of planetary life itself. Now, how many of you are actually familiar with this concept of the Anthropocene? Anyone know what this is? Well, it's a new concept introduced by scientists to account for precisely that, for the way in which human activity has eaten itself into the geological strata of the Earth, changing the material composition of the composition of the Earth itself. So basically, our existence and our activity in the world is now considered a geological age in and of itself that leaves a footprint that will forever stay with us for the rest of our lives. And so basically what I'm proposing is that data in our everyday digital lifestyles are a critical new factor in enforcing this material imprint of human activity on our lives. And the reason to point this out to you is not just to talk about the environmental cost of the digital revolutions, but to explore what it actually means for our understanding of digital literacy when we approach data through its environmental qualities. And by that, I don't just mean the ecological footprint of data, but how data kind of becomes very much part of the natural resources and the natural environment in which we operate day by day. And so what I want to offer here are an expanded understanding of literacy when we and to ask what literacy actually means when we consider this profound material imprint of data on our lives, and explore how data shapes not only social and cultural and environmental conditions, but also cognitive processes, the way we make sense and actually really relate to the world. And so I'm aligning myself with the previous speaker and many speakers before me you heard this week to argue for a broader understanding of digital literacy and data literacy in particular, to say it's not just about knowing how to calculate statistics, like I said in the beginning, but really to understand the social, cultural, environmental, and political logics that are at work as data circulates and is produced on a planetary scale day by day. And one of the critical things to acknowledge here is that literacy actually under such conditions means also acknowledging the limits of our ability to know, control, or influence these processes. Because as you can see with the example of the Anthropocene, the moment data becomes part and starts polluting the very air, the very waters you are swimming in, it becomes a process that is far beyond the human capacity to really control. And it's these kind of limits that I think should be acknowledged in our concept of data literacy as well. Not because it enables us to necessarily change it, but first of all to develop a critical understanding of it, and based on this understanding, place demands on what we want data actually to do so that it can work better in our interest, rather than sitting out there as a force acting in its own right and on its own behalf. Here's one quote that summarizes or gives us another view on the environmentality of data. Apart from the ecological footprint, what data in fact actually also does is what happens every day when you go on Facebook. You're familiar with this. You post to your friends, you chat with your colleagues. What happens with the data that you leave behind as you're doing this? Well, it's tracked and stored by Facebook to then kind of create a digital profile of yourself, to see what you like, to see the people you hang out with. And why would Facebook be doing this? To place advertisements for you, but also to adjust its own platform, the way it functions, to make sure you are coming back and using their services. And why does it need you to use its services or its platform? Precisely to sell advertising and basically to finance its operation and make money, right? But what it effectively also means is that every day, whatever you post and whenever you go online and search for something or hook up with your friends, somewhere is recording and tracking the things you do and using this data to make some form of calculation of what you might be liking to do in the future so that they can actually provide it for you the moment you only just contemplate maybe with the thought that, oh, maybe I should buy this book, right? To always already deliver it to you as an advertisement, as a suggestion, the moment you actually think it. And it's also in this sense that we can think of data as an environmental power that is very much part of our everyday life, like the air we breathe and the water we swim in, that indirectly and unexplicitly, non-explicitly, or without our necessarily awareness, shapes the things we actually do then purchase, or the sites we actually do then go to and read or do not read, right? And so it's in this sense that Hansen here speaks of a calculative ambience. Ambience is this environmental quality that whatever we do, we are already kind of inserted into cycles of calculations that try to predict who we are, what we like, in order to kind of lure us into directions where advertisers, social media companies want us to go. And so in our understanding of literacy, to acknowledge this is critically important. To at least develop a critical understanding what we do when we make choices, in the same way as we need a critical understanding what we do when we make a choice to elect someone into positions of power. But before I go further into this, which is already far advanced, let me clarify a few basic definitions of what it is we are actually talking about when we're talking about data. So if you had a guess, if you had to define what is data, how would you describe it? Say again. Friends? Trends, yes. Good suggestions. But what is a trend? Can you grasp it? Can you touch it? But what are trends made of? Behavior. Yeah, but it's visualized in terms of numbers, right? So trends are the output of precisely these calculations I was just talking about. They are summaries of behaviors calculated on the basis of, again, data. So data is kind of an informational entity. One way to define it is it's raw elements extracted from the world through observation, observing what people do, computating them and experimenting with them and keep records of it so that we can kind of assess what has happened and what might happen in the future, right? But data is also something else. Think about an Excel sheet or think about your Facebook timeline. In a way, it's also already organized information, structured in a way that makes it easy to analyze, compare it, to visualize it, and to read it and to make sense of it, right? So in a way, you can see data is many things. It comes in many forms and sizes. Data can be an object, it can be a rice corn. These are images of an exhibition in India, someone I've been working with in the past year, who does a very interesting kind of database in a northern province in India where indigenous populations, the local populations, who are fighting to reclaim their land rights. What they are doing at the moment is they're creating this community archive, a database of sorts of their collective life in their villages based on material data, based on rice corns, rice seeds they used, based on maps and documents, fingerprints, people that have been arrested. There's a lot of conflict in the government going on. And as you can see, as they assemble this data, this database is full of many, many different objects. It's rice corns, it's images, it's maps, it's kind of videos, it's books. So data comes in many forms and sizes, and the digital footprint or the digital representation of it is just one and the latest version of it, right? But it also alerts us to the fact what actually happens when you produce kind of digital representations. You're transforming the existence of an object into a new order of existence. You give it kind of a life and an existence on its own, right? It's no longer, so in this case, I think part of data literacy also means acknowledging that data are not just, function not just like images as we used to think of them, representing people, faces, places, whatever. As media students, you know about the politics representation, you had about framing, about stereotyping, but data does something much more than this. Data does not represent the world as wholes, like the jar of glass you see, but breaks this glass of rice down individual attributes. The name of the rice sort, the size of the rice corns, the number of years it has been used. And all these kind of different values then become available for all sorts of calculations that when you do them fundamentally change how you can look and what you can actually do with this information. So data in a way, let me see. How do things become data? Data break things down into individual attributes. But it also allows us to put things in context with other things and establish new comparisons. Again, that changes our perspective on the thing itself. If I look at Hala, I can describe her as I know her as a student. If I look at Hala and say, who's she actually hooking up with on social media? I can collect much more information about her. So she's kind of hanging out with the hip-hop crowd, right? And so she has been with the You Stink protests, so she seems to be civically active as well, right? All this information she might not necessarily disclose to me, but it becomes available to me once I start collecting other kind of information and store kind of the things you do in digital form, break them down into individual attributes, and then start to classify and sort them into a new entity. And it's this transformation that is not only transforming the material substance of the thing, but what else does it do? That's the positive version of expressing it. It gives me a better understanding, but it also gives me tremendous power about Hala, because I can say things about her now that, like I said, she wouldn't actually maybe want me to say or even want me to know, right? And it's this what I mean when I speak about social and cultural logics of data, and why we need to understand them to develop a responsible way of not only producing it as everyday consumers, but also using it as media scholars, as researchers, as journalists, right? So one of the important facts to acknowledge about data is that it actually doesn't speak for itself. It requires multiple processes of filtering and selection, of simplification and arrangement. It needs to be corrected and summarized, because sometimes with the amount of data we have right now, it simply becomes unreadable. There's just too much of it. So you inevitably need to compress it somehow, but what do you do when you summarize? You reduce something to certain things that you consider important, but that may not correspond how the thing you describe or the person you describe thinks of itself. And so it's in this sense that I would say that data actually recreates and reconfigures the world by disassembling them into individual attributes and values from which new knowledge can be produced, but also that allows us to kind of present them in ways that may not necessarily correspond to their actual existence or the actual meaning people, animals, the earth itself would assign to itself. And so here's just a short depiction of the processes that take place once we start to process data. If you look at the life cycle, it starts with the collection of data. We have to collect it somehow. We make choices. Who do we actually include? What do we include? What kind of data do we collect? But then we need to organize it, as I just mentioned. We need to index it, describe what is this actually. Is this a shoe size? Is this a house number? Is this a street address? And then we need to store it somewhere, right? Which is a choice of what format do I give this data, right? I have millions. I've been active on digital media since 1990. Many of the things I've done back then, I can no longer access them. Why? Because they're stored in formats for which there are no machines anymore, right? The floppy disk, anyone still remember this? I mean, what do you do with this stuff? So storage becomes an issue in terms of what kind of data is available to us and how readable it actually is. And then there's modeling. What is data modeling? It's using data, what we will do in the workshop, to ask questions, right? And to develop theories and hypotheses of the things we may be able to answer when we use this data, the kind of questions we want to ask to data. And the kind of questions you ask, of course, already determine, in a way, what you will be able to read out of it. We will see a lot of this in the workshop. And then you actually analyze these outcomes, which is another process of translation. You need to visualize it, another way of framing of summary processes you are aware of. And then you circulate it out to the world, where people actually read it and make sense of it or not. So in all these processes, what you basically do is you're translating what you find in the world into something else that potentially takes on a life and of itself. But let me show you, based on specific examples, what it can actually mean as a means also for us to develop a critical understanding and start asking critical questions to the kind of data that is collected and what is actually done with it. This is a project done by the University of California in Los Angeles, and it's basically a cultural study of selfies. What they have done is they collected 4,500 selfies out of a random sample of 140,000 Instagram photos and analyzed them to find shared cultural patterns. So as you can see, 30,000 images were collected from Tokyo, 30,000 from New York, 20,000 from Bangkok, 20,000 from Berlin, another 20,000 from Moscow, and another 20,000 from Sao Paulo. Now, how do you put this into a database? What do you need to do? Huh? Classify, but who does the classifying? What they have done, there's something called the Mechanical Turk. These are people offering the services through Amazon to do this kind of slave-type labor, going through these 450,000 or whatever amount of images it was, and index, classify them. Where have they been taken? By was the person taking it a female, a male? How old roughly can I read? How old the person is? To start collecting what is known as metadata about this image that allows us to store it into a database and then use it to calculate cultural trends, right? So they had hundreds of people doing this kind of slave labor on them online. But then, most interestingly, they didn't look at the images themselves. How long would you sit to look at 450,000 images on your own and identify, find similarities? Would you actually be able to see similarities between this amount of images? So what do? You need to develop an algorithm, a line of code, a mathematical command, if you wish, that then can work on its own to identify certain things that you tell it to identify as it goes through these images. And in this particular case, what they have done is they developed a piece of code that started to look at eyes, the position of the eyes, the position of the mouth, is someone smiling or not, and degrees of different emotional or positions, emotional expressions or positions of the head. And here it becomes interesting. Can a piece of code read emotions? How would you do that? And so basically what they have done is emotions is looking at the position of the head was then classified, associated with being happy. Or having kind of your mouth falling down is like sad or moderate, right? Or holding your head like this, like you are right now, looking weird, making fun, right? So all these assumptions were kind of read off automatically from these images, creating their own representation of the person and the image in this case, to then become the source material to make very grand generalizations about cultural differences between Tokyo and Sao Paulo, about what the selfie is, how it's used, and what kind of things people express through selfies. And it's here where we need to become mindful. On one way, projects like this show us the exciting new possibilities that have opened up with big data and algorithmic kind of computations to read through massive amounts of data. And at the same time, they also alert us to the fact, to the gross generalizations and the many, many assumptions that are built into the process, because it could not otherwise be done, that may significantly distort and transform the actual substance and meaning of the thing you're talking about. So let's look at what they have found. People take less selfies than actually is assumed. On what basis do they say this? It's compared to the number of overall images on Instagram. But does it actually allow them to say that based on this comparison? What is Instagram? There's nothing but images on Instagram. So already, when you compare the number of selfies to the number of other images on Instagram, the chances are very likely that selfies make only a tiny fraction, right? Because you can take a photo from anywhere and anything. And so this being exclusively about images kind of gives you a distorted picture, because it's first of all just looking at the image output in and of itself, but the image output of whom? Is this the world population? It's the already image active people. So already we are looking at a very specific crowd of people that is not representative of the population as a whole. And it may be, what does most often mean? Most often doesn't mean the amount of images you take, but the moments you take them in. So have they really measured those moments? No, they have measured the proportion of selfies to other categories of photographs to come up that only 5% of Instagram make photographs. So the only valid conclusion to be drawn from this is what? That 4% of all photos posted on Instagram are actually selfies. That's the much more boring fact, right? So as journalists, as upcoming journalists, you need to be careful, although the actual relationship you can establish may be the less boring, the less exciting news and a bit boring, it does make sense to kind of alert people and put things into the right proportions to not contribute to the massive distortion that can be achieved by the massive amounts of data we are circulating today. Again, compared on the already selective group they have been looking at, they found that significantly more women take selfies than men. And here specifically in Bangkok, 1 times more than in Berlin. And in Moscow they found a particular striking pattern that in Moscow women are much more active in terms of selfie productions than men. They also found Bangkok has the youngest selfie population. The average age is 21, while compared to New York City it's 25. And here it's this emotional score that I mentioned before. So they measured smile scores. How often do people smile on selfies compared to different countries? And as you can see, which are the cities or where people smile the most? Bangkok and Sao Paulo come second, right? And extremist poses, again, that's a bit of a difficult measure. Women have the more extreme poses. So the representations of the colors are women compared to men. Here's another example. It's quite an interesting study of the University in Amsterdam. What they have done is they looked up, they tried to find out to what extent Google can be used as a tool to understand society in general. And what they have done is they tried to assess based on search results, when you type the word rights or law, in the country-specific site of Google, the Google with the Lebanese country code compared to the Google site of Saudi Arabia, and used the hierarchy of search results related to rights, women's rights, environmental rights, digital rights, they received to kind of estimate and calculate the things that are most important or most relevant in these societies. But they also used this data to find out which countries actually have unique laws that no one else has. And then they represented this in this kind of visual form and in this visual manner. Each icon stands for a particular right type. There are certain laws related to where you can walk, or there are even rights for objects in some places. It's too small, the typo. I was hoping I can read it. But in any case, the black ones are unique rights you have in different countries, right? So in a way, it's a very interesting way of looking at societies. Because, but at the same time, there are many, many questions we need to ask when we are using Google and what people do on Google as a representation of actual behaviors. In what way could that be problematic or rather distorting than revealing? Where's my water? Yeah. What is a Google PageRank? Well, Google itself has its own algorithm that when you search for something, in order to deliver you good results, it creates a hierarchy of pages that are relevant to the thing you search for, right? And it has to be said it's one of the most sophisticated and most admired algorithms in the world. Even Microsoft, every competitor, they completely envy Google for its ability to do that. Because when you use Google, how often do you use Google? Every day, right? I use it all, I ask Google all sorts of questions. What should I eat today? Where should I travel? Everything. I use it for correcting my typos. How do I spell a word? I Google it, right? Because it really is quite accurate and quite accurate. It's quite good in pointing relevant things to you, right? But again, it's a calculation, right? So on one hand, it gives us a powerful pointer towards things, because how is this relevance calculated? It's calculated not only by people actually looking at the content, is this actually relevant to someone searching for rights, but it also counts the number of times people actually use and go to the site to use it as a resource. So our own kind of trust in information is also built into this algorithm, and that's why it's more powerful than others, because it already also considers our own judgments about information in the information it gives back to us. And so there are good reasons to use it as an indicator of what people consider relevant and to be important. But of course, it's not a representation of society, right? Or think about the study, the selfie study. What does it actually measure? Yeah. But self-esteem, that's already, I mean, you're buying into what they're trying to suggest, right? That's what they would like to do. But is it justified on the basis of what they have actually done, measuring whether you smile or not, or whether you have what they labeled as an extreme position of your head, that you are a weird person or not, or whether people tend to take weirder positions and are therefore maybe more experimental in Moscow than in Sao Paulo? Are these justified conclusions on the basis of this data? No, but what the study reminds us of is it's nonetheless a good demonstration of what can be done if we had more meaningful questions to ask when you use these capacities afforded by big data. And at the same time, it also comes as a very powerful reminder of what I before called this environmental quality of data. How everything we do is constantly kind of linked up into some form of calculation done by someone to draw conclusions about us somehow that then feed back into the things we read, the things we see on our Facebook pages, the search results we get on our. And it's in this way that data has become part of the air we breathe, and shapes not just consciously what we think and read, but subconsciously without us necessarily being aware of it, right? Okay, so just to move on, the main point I'm trying to make is, or another way of putting it is, that data actually has rhetorical qualities of its own. What do I mean by that? What is rhetorics? You're media students, you're supposed to know this. Data is constructed to support or develop a certain argument. Rhetoric is the art of argument, right? So data doesn't just exist out there, or like I said before, it doesn't just speak for itself. It's produced for a purpose. And if it's simply exhausted, as we do when we use Google or Facebook, it's then this information that is turned into something that supports an argument, and even if it's only the argument to convince an advertiser to place an ad here because it's you using this site, right? And the interesting thing about, and so once we start to acknowledge the rhetorical qualities of data, it becomes very clear that data literacy cannot stop at the question of understanding what data is and what you can do with it. It's understanding what can be done with data and what does data actually do to the things we represent in it once we start producing data about the world. And so an important distinction, or sometimes data are immediately equated with facts. The moment we see a statistical table somewhere in a scientific study, it's considered a fact. Someone has studied it, someone has tested it, so we take it as true, right? But the interesting thing about data is data are not facts. A fact ceases to be a fact once you prove it to be wrong. Then it can no longer be called a fact. Data continues to be data whether it's wrong or not, right? It's out there, it can be used, it's called data, it doesn't fundamentally change its semantic or material or social meaning, regardless of its actually epistemic or regardless of its truth value. And so that's also an important distinction to bear in mind when we speak about data as one of these, what we call epistemic categories or informational entities. Epistemic means the way describes all the things through which we come to understand or know the world, right? But the examples also remind us what I said before, that data doesn't stand in a linear deterministic relationship to the things represented in it. It transforms it, it changes it, it gives us a partial, a fragmented description of the world, right? And these descriptions can be infinitely reconfigured and rearranged into whatever we want it to be or whatever argument we want to support. And so the truth value of data is not a function of the data itself. There's only so many ways you can transform an image. With data, you can do pretty much anything. Or even once you break down an image into data, same applies here. You can transform it in whatever way you want. So really, the truth value of data lies in the questions and the kind of calculations you perform, is my basic point. And so if we wanted to kind of put data into relation to the other elements or resources we have available to kind of make sense of the world, data is really on the very bottom end. It's elements we extract from the world in a very raw and unfiltered form, but for data to become information, knowledge, or wisdom, it must undergo several processes of course, selection and kind of producing meaning, meaningful acts. But these meaningful acts, as I've shown, also contain a lot of kind of distortion and manipulation that kind of shapes the way we can use data and are using data to make sense of the world. And so it's another way, a fun way of looking at it. Someone said, if information and knowledge are kind of the recipe for making a great cake, data is really the raw material, right? And so the reason for me to mention this is to point to, but I think the point is clear now, that this process of translation of data into knowledge, into information, into wisdom we have about the world, it's not self-evident, and it's by far not clear the direction in which it goes. And again, we are on the weakest side of things to control how this process really takes place, right? And it's in that sense that I was trying to point out to you that data is always invested in or invested with certain political, cultural, and scientific logics that shape what it actually does and says, and how we can actually use it. And at the same time, because there's a lot of manipulation or distortion involved, data also shapes these very logics themselves. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling cycle. Here's just another diagram to show you just, again, a summary of the many, many processes and steps of filtering and processing that are taking place when we work in and through data. Let's look at some more examples. Any questions in between? Do I actually have I have 10 more minutes? Is that correct? Well, I'll show you just one more alarming example then. Here's another study done by the UCLA again, to bring us back to environmental qualities of data. What they have tried to do is collect Twitter data to identify HIV hotspots in a city. What's an HIV hotspot? HIV hotspots are places in the city where there's a strong concentration of people lenient to use drugs or to engage in behaviors that are known to be conducive to transmit HIV, right? So they were collecting 550 million tweets. Again, developing an algorithm using keywords indicating things like sex, getting high, needles, to identify and to then look at this data and filter out 9,000 tweets, and then looked at what? Again, at the metadata. Where were these tweets posted? Was men or women, roughly, is there an age that can be assessed or related to this data? And can it be related to some specific place in the city? And the main purpose for them to do is to see where are these areas in the city where these people tend, is there actually a concentration of places where these people tend to gather in the city. In this case, they compared states, and one of the findings was that California, Texas, New York, Florida had the highest number of tweets indicating risky behavior. And on the city level compared, it was Washington, D.C., Louisiana, South Carolina. Why are people doing this? Why is UCLA doing this? Could you think of a meaningful, positive way of using data in this kind of sense, of spying on you on Twitter in this way? Awareness, yeah. But also to provide medical services, right? So it would make sense if you have this information and are really able to identify where do these people hang out, to have something like a mobile clinic, or in some countries where it's legal, medics would provide clean needles to make sure if I cannot stop a person using drugs, at least what I can give them is clean stuff to kind of engage in these kind of activities, right? It's a controversial concept, but in theory this would be possible to do. What are reasons of concern when clinics or researchers start doing this? Exactly. What you say on Twitter can be completely misunderstood. You may use, oh, I would so love to get high now, without having ever thought even about marijuana, right? So is what we say on Twitter really translatable into effective actions? That's quite a big leap to make, right? How many song texts are there playing with this kind of language? Maybe you are just telling something, the line you have just listened to of one of your favorite songs. So there's a kind of a lot of misunderstanding that can take place if you use social media data in this way. Similarly, does talking about sex actually mean doing it? You know from your circle of friends how much more is talked about sex than actually takes place, right? And when it takes place, it may precisely not be talked about, right? So the accuracy is really quite questionable in this regard. But one of the most important questions is, do you think Twitter users were actually asked for their consent? No, because it's considered public data. What people do on Twitter is kind of they are engaging in public, and so researchers take the liberty to just use this data in this way. But is it ethically justifiable? It's rather questionable, because you're infringing on someone's privacy and using information that was not given for the context of a study for purposes that this person may not necessarily disagree with, right? And so in this way, to sum it up, we can say that of course, can you see a powerful promise or powerful opportunities that are offered by these kind of big data analytics? Can you see something positive in it? Yes? For example, why is it good to have these kind of opportunities? At least get a sense and then use this data to see if it's actually true. So it really is a powerful way of developing a view of society that simply is not available to us as humans. We cannot compare 450,000 images. Or we can, but it would take us years, right? We cannot look at an entire country or continent for HIV hotspots. That's just impossible to assess if you would try to do it by foot, right? So these forms of abstractions that data actually offers is quite a powerful way of becoming far more effective and efficient in learning, understanding, and studying societies, right? It gives us ways of observing the world that are simply not available to us as humans. And it also allows us to put things into relation that would be otherwise completely hard to do. But at the same time, you could also think of data, it adds an additional layer, it gives a new material existence to people, to objects, to things as they exist in the world, opening them up to being infinitely reconfigured and rearranged. And so it's in the sense that people often talk about data as kind of an extract, a substrate of society. I would argue data is actually quite the opposite. It adds an additional dimension to the social world and the natural world in which we exist, infinitely reconfiguring it and recreating it according to distinct cultural and political or social logics that are available or developed. And so one way of understanding it would also be to say data is a very specific form of abstraction that doesn't make things immaterial. Yes?
What do you mean by new dimension? Understanding the trends of the society, how society will act?
The moment I collect data on you, you no longer exist as you just sit there right now talking to me. I also establish an existence of your digital persona on my computer or server that I can then treat as a person in and of itself, that stands in some form of relationship to it, but it extends your presence and your existence as a human being on this planet onto my computer in a very material sense. Material in the sense that I can work with the information the data I collected on you contains, and material in the sense that what I can do with it that may influence or make you visible in certain ways. I can render you into a statistical indicator of female trends in Lebanon, right? So you cease to exist as a human person in and of yourself, but extend your presence onto all sorts of Excel sheets, computer servers, companies. Exactly, you become a pixel, yeah. And the pixel is not a material part of your body, but a virtual extension, a new dimension of your embodied existence, yeah? Exactly, yeah. Yes, like I said, the promise is that it allows us to look at people and societies in ways that we simply cannot, that are not available to us as human beings. But at the same time, we cease to exist as self-enclosed entities in and for ourselves and our family and friends or university colleagues. We kind of, we take on a life on other people's computers, computer servers, that can have a significant impact on how we actually live our life. Because this data can be used to steer, at least in certain directions, what you read, what is known about you, and policy decisions that are made on the basis of your profile. So, but you're right to suggest it's both sides. And I've said that many times, but since you mention it, the profile, it's really, I wanted to end with this. The profile is not an innocent cultural technology. Anyone ever heard about Lombroso or anthropological criminology? The profile is a very old cultural technology that didn't just come up with the digital age, but it emerged with the very moment that societies actually start to measure things. When was this moment? Anyone have a guess? Well, roughly the 17th and 18th century, on the onset of what we call modernity, where we shifted from agricultural societies and monarchies to become modern industrial and republican societies where that acknowledged the citizen as a self-determined subject, where people started to educate themselves, and technologies and knowledge was made available actually to learn and look and understand the world in completely new ways. This moment was very much bound to new technologies of measurement. Think about Galileo measuring rotations of the Earth. Think about telescopes. Think about all the scientific inventions that allowed people to study chemistry, biology, to look inside things. This was not available before. In the Middle Ages, people saw a tree and that was that, right? And had to believe in God to kind of see or develop ideas, what a tree is for, what it does, and why it's actually here in the world, right? These new technologies of measurement allowed people to look inside things and understand how they relate to each other. What does water do to a tree? And where does the human being fit into these organisms, right? But what these technologies also did, it became very tempting to measure the world for all sorts of things. How big is the Earth? How big is a country? Can we actually divide land? It's again, the border as a separation, a numerical line of dividing kind of people from each other emerged in this very moment, along with political transformations. But it's precisely how technology and political processes interact that make technology and data in particular such powerful instruments and invested with a lot of social and cultural and political logics. And what happened at the same time is this ability to measure everything led some scientists to think, well, actually what if we measure people not just for how big they are, their body weight, whatever, the races, colors, can I measure criminal behavior? Because data, because it's such a powerful tool to look at societies, it is also a powerful tool to control societies, right? And so the thought, can I measure criminal behavior or the leniency of criminal behavior, became very tempting, right? And so Lombroso was one of those scientists who really believed people are born criminals. If you're born criminal, there's nothing I can do to change you. And not only that, it shows in the physical shape of people's heads and bodies, right? So he started to create very much in the way that people develop profiles now about our preferences in terms of food and books. He developed profiles according, or in the same way they measured selfies, he measured head shapes and linked them to digital profile, to known criminals' photos, to see if he can identify a pattern that allows us to see, that's the shape of a criminal head, so he's a criminal, right? In what way is that an adequate way of measurement? I mean, it just is an illustration. I'm using this example. It's, of course, the grossest form of stigmatizing people and rendering people into potential suspects on the basis of pure speculation, right? There is simply no proof up until this day that criminal behavior can in any way is, first of all, built into your genes, and much less can be read off your face, right? But can you see a continuity, a similarity between what this person has done in the 18th century and the selfie study I showed you in the beginning of this lecture? It's this incredible seductive moment, or the seduction of measurement, that leads people to measure things and come up with explanations simply on the basis of the fact that they now can measure things they have not been able to measure before. And so measurement and data also nurture this sense of certainty where there is no certainty to be established because of its very material quality. After all, data is there, it's there, I can see it, I can measure the head, and I compare it to other things, and if these patterns show up, why should they not be true, right? So this logic of calculation and measurement has seeped into our everyday kind of way of making sense of the world to an extent, and this of course has exploded tremendously with the amounts of data we produce today and the technology we have available today to compare and measure all sorts of things and put them into relation to all sorts of things, right? And so I'm making this big leap from, I'm not saying Facebook is engaged in anything close to criminal anthropology, and even the selfie study isn't. But I'm making this comparison to show you how seductive it is when we now go on and work in the workshop. Once you see these things on an Excel sheet, or you can drag and drop them, and they appear as data points, how seductive it becomes to develop all sorts of calculations that have no actual basis or actually no justification, but can have tremendous consequences for the people you're actually measuring. Yes?
I understand that if we have an idea, by collecting an idea, or let's say an opinion or an objective, by collecting a data, okay, the idea exists. We collect the data in order to justify it. Is it a scientific way of proving idea or objective?
Say again, please.
Suppose I have an idea. I'll go to prove it. I'll go and collect data and do all the needed calculation and graph in order, having in mind, to justify this theory or this concept or this objective. That's what you mean, and they used to do first. And is it a scientific way of doing this?
That's what they say, but is it? That's the question I'm asking.
Here I understand
this cannot be answered on a general, on a general level. So these are the steps you need to take to attempt to study something thoroughly. But to what extent this is justified depends on, I showed you the diagram before, what happens on all the different steps on the way, from the collection to storage, to sorting, organizing, what questions you want to ask, how you phrase these questions, how well supported these questions are by other knowledge that exists out there, and how that then leads you to select what you calculate and how you calculate it, and how you then translate these calculations into actual findings. How well you acknowledge the limits of calculation to actually come up with accurate knowledge, and how you then, how openly you admit this in public, or even make your data available in public for others to test whether what you say is true.
So why should I do and collect the data? Am I not having an idea behind it? This is the idea. If I want to collect the data concerning any subject, it means I have a hidden objective or a hidden idea. Yeah. Okay, my task is to justify it.
You're perfectly right. There's no, I mean, of course, there's no other way of
collecting data, it should have, a catalyst. The catalyst, this pre-built idea, that's what I mean. And mainly, I mean, according to my reading, mainly all the studies, collect these data in order to justify the pre-idea which was built, fixed at the beginning. That's what most, let's say, research done in our countries here in the Arab world.
Well, ideally, a scientific study would either test or try to challenge existing knowledge or add something new to it. But of course, there is a substantive number of studies, not just in the Arab world, who just try to prove what they thought all along, right? This risk always exists, and that's the very reason why we are sitting here, to alert us to the fact what actually happens in each moment of these decisions that are made when we start collecting data and try to prove, which is a legitimate need, we try to test an argument. What we need to be careful about as we try and do this, right? And so I think on that end, I'm closing at this point to lead us on to the workshop. Any questions? Did I halfway make sense? Was I able to make sense?
This way of research to me makes me feel like we're underestimating the power of human beings. I mean, for researchers now, all they see in humans are just, they're using them for data. They see them as numbers just to calculate something. Just like the scientists did with the heads, all we saw in the humans were just getting their heads for whatever reason. He doesn't see them as humans.
Yes, there's a dehumanizing element in it. Certainly right. And yet, at the same time, data can also be used. I didn't include them because you have seen so many examples this week of digital activism and people using data. Just look at the youth income. Where are you from? Which country? Egypt. I mean, we don't have to start the usual discussion about the revolution, but you can see also the power to connect people. And the people power that data can have once people are in control of the infrastructure, right? Like I said, it requires a humbleness to acknowledge that there's only a certain extent to which you can control the process. So it's neither either or. Data and computers and technology is always both. It has a deeply human component because after all it is a human invention. And it's human minds that determine the logic on which they operate. But they can be profoundly inhuman, right? And what I'm trying to stress is because of that, and because the power of data is so much beyond our immediate control, we need to understand it even better to enhance our chances, to stop just accepting data as this environmental thing out there that kind of we breathe in as we breathe in air, but to just in the same way as we demand clean air right now, we demand data that serves our interest and not the interest of someone else. But in order to do that effectively, it's not just screaming for open data. Like I talk more about this in the workshop, but screaming for access to data. It's placing demand what data can be and is in fact collected about us in the first place. And of course then make it available to others to work with it for more human ends. We won't stop the bad guys in simple terms, but at least let's enhance our chances to confront it with something that is productive and serves our interest, right?
Hello. How can something that is bound to be biased or make errors be one of the aspects of research? And can personal data be used in courts? And if I tweeted about something,
can personal data
be used in courts? If, for example, I tweeted something about marijuana and it should be legal. Would I be accused of taking drugs?
Right now, not, but increasingly social media data is used in court cases. I'm not sure if the person speaking about privacy has said. In divorce cases, you see it. The tweets, Snapchat, Tinder, posts you post on these sites, it is now accepted as evidence for being unfaithful, which is reason for breaking up a marriage. And there will be, right now you would actually need a search warrant to allow access to social media to be used. But these are the official versions. Everyone heard about Edward Snowden, right? So you know that there's the official law, and there are then the ways in which it is enacted or bypassed under the pretext of various national security, terrorism threat, whatever. What is the consequence of Paris, of Belgium, of all these attacks we have seen recently, Tunisia? The first thing you hear is, we need access to this data. Because had we seen this, we would have prevented it. The problem is, all the people were known. Some of them were even registered, called in for interviewing, policing. The problem is they could not see and make the right connections, right? And because they are realizing this, it's the connection we are missing because it's beyond our human capacity to compare this one person to the rest of the world population, that we miss the link. But algorithmic technology and big data computing allows you to do that and find it at least more effectively. It will never be perfect, but because of these assumptions, they immediately start to demand access to precisely to this data. So right now, not really or fully, informally yes, for security purposes, but increasingly it is becoming not only part of evidence used in courts, but also you can be arrested for what you tweet. In my social media class, I have one example. Guy comes to the airport on his way to university to do an exam, flight is cancelled, and he tweets to his friends, "Oh my God, I'm gonna blow up this place," right? He was immediately arrested because he was read as a terrorism threat, right? And he became kind of the trigger of a huge protest movement and debate in the UK. Can we really treat a tweet on the same basis as we can read kind of a letter of an intended attack found in someone's bedroom, right? And so the judges have been quite wise and say, please, let's put this in proportion. This guy, did he actually make any attempts to follow up on these actions? No, so they let him go, right? But it's becoming increasingly tight. Okay, so then thank you for now, and